Hello, I'm Annette Patrone, and I'm going to be going over the legal and ethical considerations in nursing informatics. Nursing informatics is defined by the National League of Nursing as combining nursing science, information management science, and computer science to manage and process nursing data, information and knowledge to deliver quality of care to the public. Nursing informatics facilitates the integration of data, information, and knowledge to support patients, nurses, and other providers in their decision making in all roles and settings. This support is accomplished through the use of information structures, information processes, and information technology. The goal of nursing informatics is to improve the health of populations, communities, families, and individuals by optimizing information management and communication. The American Nursing Association goes into more detail regarding the scope of practice with informatics, but first let's start by defining confidentiality. Confidentiality is the ethical principle or legal right that a physician or other health professionals will hold secret all information relating to a patient unless the patient gives consent permitting disclosure. Confidentiality in the U.S. is also protection of healthcare information and maintained and mandated by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act and the Joint Commission. So HIPAA helps patients keep their privacy and helps ensure nursing staff and other healthcare team members have the right tools in order to know what to do regarding confidentiality. The disclosure of information can be given to a physician, a nurse, or facility in general. But think about how many people have access to your records when you go into a hospital. Just because there's access doesn't mean that it's ethical to look at someone's healthcare record. The only personnel who should be looking at a patient's electronic health record are those who are currently involved in the patient's care. It can be deemed unethical to even look at a previous patient's record to see how they're currently doing. So if you have a patient that you saw 2 days ago and they got moved to a different unit and now you just want to check up on them, that's not even ethical to look at their record again because you're not currently involved in their health care. Nurses need to uphold the rights of the patient and give them their privacy. Confidentiality can play a very large role in this. Privacy is another big part of it. Privacy is a state of mind and freedom from intrusion or control over the exposure of self or personal information. There can be a breach in confidentiality and privacy, and this is a disclosure of private information to a third party not involved with the patient's care or without the patient's consent or even a court order. Disclosure can be oral or written, by telephone or fax, or electronically, for example, an email or health information network. Accessing the medical records of a patient without legitimate reason is also considered a breach of confidentiality. So like checking up on that patient, that's a breach. Consent must be given in order to protect the patient and to protect the nurse as well. The nurse must know who he or she is allowed to share information with. This can become a very tricky situation for some people as their healthcare needs may change or their level of consciousness or their cognitive function may decline over the years and they may get confused and not know or want certain people to have information. So, what is a consent? A consent is an agreement or an approval of permission or given voluntarily or by a competent person that acts for some stated purpose. So, for example, a patient may consent to having their personal health information collected by a clinic or consent to a disclosure to a third party. So, working in a facility, I have to get consent from patients when they come in for our doctor and our healthcare staff to have access to their records, but also that we may give records that we collect to other parties. Say, if a patient has a cardiology appointment, we need to have the consent in order to send them their current status and healthcare records to that cardiology appointment or release information to a family member even. Consent can be given for certain treatments and to only certain professionals as well. Consent does not have to be an all or nothing kind of thing. However, consent must be given in order to treat the patient. This can become a very tricky situation. What happens when a patient arrives in an emergency room and is unconscious? The emergency room nurse must assume that the patient will consent to any life-saving treatment. This may not be the case, but without the proper documentation, how can you determine that? You don't know what the patient can consent or would not consent to. Or what if there's a confused patient and there's no power of attorney or legal representative? An elderly person with dementia or someone with a mental illness may not give consent to a healthcare staff because they are scared and confused. This is where the ethical boundaries can become fuzzy. Nurses are the patient's advocates, but how do you treat someone who is not competent enough to make a decision but has every legal right to do it? So, for example, someone that is mentally ill or does have dementia and is scared in an emergency situation, and they're not making a sound, rational judgment regarding treatment, or not even letting a healthcare team member help them at all, it becomes very difficult for the nursing staff to do anything for them and to help them move forward. So that's kind of one of those situations. What do? You have to kind of go to your facility's policies or kind of like an ethical board to say, how do we move forward? How do we treat this patient when they're refusing everything, but they're not exactly in sound mind to do so? Okay, so without jumping too far into an ethical debate, let's continue on how nurses can ethically keep a patient's information private while using informatics. A healthcare agency must first take an evaluation of themselves in an attempt to understand what they need to work on regarding electronic healthcare protection and the steps they need to take in order to keep you secure. A little lost. So basically, the steps for security: you need to assess the risks and the assets. You need to form an organized plan of what you're going to do for those electronic and technological records. You need to understand the culture of the security and establish and reinforce policies. This is a big key to this, is you need to set boundaries and enforce them of what you're going to do. So a lot of security measures for informatics can include firewalls, antivirus and spyware protection, things of, like we talked about, a need-to-know basis, automatic sign-off, so your computer logs you off after a certain time period of not being active, and physical restrictions to certain things in the healthcare team. For example, a floor nurse may not have access to the patient's insurance information. It's not needed for their treatment. It's not needed for their daily thing. So only billing has access to that. Or an administrator may have access to all the patient's information, but the floor nurse or the respiratory therapist only has access to this small amount because that's only what's deemed necessary for them. Passwords and password protection can be one of the most inexpensive and effective ways to maintain privacy. Passwords must remain private and should not be shared throughout the facility or organization with anyone else. You have your own password, you keep it that way. Passwords should change regularly and should be slightly complex. A lot of passwords now require capital, a numeric value, and a symbol in them. It can't just be, a name or just a name and a number anymore. A lot of things for passwords is they don't want you to reuse the same passwords. There's a lot of things that are safeguarded in that. You also have the ethical dilemma that you might face outside of healthcare, and passwords can help protect that too. So I'm going to give some examples of an ethical issue with mobile computing too, which is also taking your healthcare record to another place. basically sitting at a coffee shop, sitting in a public forum. It can be very difficult to remember all the steps to maintain someone's privacy when you have to bring your work home or in a public forum. This does happen often. This is something that happens to me quite often. I'm a clinical liaison, so I basically am working around the clock. I'm on call around the clock. I can get a phone call at any time or a text message saying so and so's in the hospital. Can you look up their information? All these things. I frequently have to pull information from electronic healthcare records when I'm not inside the facility. Um, so, one of the biggest examples is my daughter is a competitive dancer. So, she is at the studio for 3 to 4 hours at a time, multiple nights during the week. So, I have to bring my work with me sometimes. Now, everyone at the studio is very conscious of working in privacy because we also have two occupational therapists that bring their work with them. We have an emergency room coordinator that has to sometimes have her work with her. And we have a case manager that actually works at an area hospital that has their work with them. I mean, even right now, like I'm sitting in my office and I had to be cognizant of what's around me, so there's no patient information. So it's very difficult when you're in a public place to protect that healthcare information. And passwords can be a big part of it, signing yourself on and off your computer. But you also have to think about a lot of things like someone stealing your computer if you leave it laying around, or stealing your cell phone if you're not signing into your email. There's a lot of considerations for this, and it's a very big ethical problem for nurses, especially when they have to take their information outside of that building. So just some things to consider when talking about ethical nursing and informatics. Thank you and have a good day.